All right, and so we are here today to talk about Congress's role in checking the president's emergency acts abuses. And I think we're all very well familiar with the fact that Trump has engaged in an unprecedented number of emergency invocations in this first year as president. And so I think we should just first invite each of our panelists to give their take on the current state of affairs, and then we will get into different slices of this problem. And I'm going to start with you, James.
Sure. Well, thank you, Amanda. And I just want to start off by saying thank you to Greg. I mean, Greg's someone I've worked with for a long time on Capitol Hill, and I often will spar with Greg sometimes, not literally, but, and, Greg has, he's the kind of character and intellect I think we all want, regardless of what our opponent may believe. He's very thoughtful. He's respectful, and he pushes me a lot, and I love that. And I think we need more of that in our society today. So thank you, Greg, for that, and thank you for letting me be here. I'm not often on the far left. This is a new thing for me. But, as a longtime Senate staffer and a member of the conservative insurgents in the Senate, I like to say that, it's the far left, the far right. It's as long as I'm on one of those, I'll feel more comfortable. So when I'm in the center, I start to worry. But no, I just want to start off with a couple of very brief framing observations, because implicit in this topic today is this notion of this separation of powers. And I think it's important for us to stop for a minute and articulate the assumptions that we have about the separation of powers, recognize it up close, because that will help inform our understanding of the underlying topic, and then also potential solutions, ways that we can solve the problem that you may or may not see. Right? And so the first thing I would like to say, and Ilya, I apologize, as I'm not an attorney. I taught constitutional law at Clemson University for a number of years, and I was charged with structures of government. I'm not a rights and liberties guy. I'm a structures guy. And in the structures of government course, I'm teaching people that it's the structure of our Constitution that is absolutely essential for us to realize the fundamental principles on which our polity is based, things like justice, equality, and liberty. And the Constitution does that because it creates a permanent space for politics. That is, for individuals to come together and govern themselves through bargaining, negotiation, and persuasion. And this is absolutely critical because throughout human history, when we disagree about what justice means and liberty and equality in particular situations, and when up close, what happens is that we typically resort to force and violence instead of politics to resolve our disagreements. The Constitution, for the first time in human history, so far as I can tell, breaks free of that cycle. And it creates a permanent space for politics. And the way it does so, again, we all know this, is through, among other things, the separation of powers. But the separation of powers is an interesting thing, and I think it's important, again, at the outset of this, to articulate what it means. Right? The concept itself comes from the mid-17th century English civil wars, right? We always talk about the French chopping the head off their king, but the English, they did it well before the French did. And the idea was that you have separate branches of government, and they're given separate functions or powers, and then you have separate people who are entrusted with that power. Well, the problem with that, as history shows us, is that it doesn't work. There's no way to keep one of those branches, one of those powers, from encroaching on the territory of the others. So the framers, maybe they stumbled into it, maybe they were just enlightened for whatever reason. The framers came up with the solution of taking the idea of checks and balances, which is inherent in mixed government, which is an older notion, and they injected it into the separation of powers. So they muddled it a little bit. And they said, look, the way we're going to ensure that this system lasts, that we have a permanent space for politics and not force and violence, is by giving some of the branch's power to another branch. Because if Congress is going to encroach upon the executive, it's going to do so using its power to make law. That's literally what it does. So what do we need to do? Let's give the executive a little bit of the legislative power. Let's let the executive veto laws, right? And vice versa, the confirmation process, etc. And so what does this mean for our discussion today? It means that, one, the separation of powers is a dynamic thing. It is a dynamic and ongoing thing. It is not static. It's not like you can just sit there and say 1 + 1 equals separation of powers. That's not it at all. It is a give and take. It is fundamentally adverbial. And it is loaded with conflict if it's working properly. This is Madison's famous dictum of ambition counteracting ambition. Last time I checked, you can't have that unless you're literally fighting with one another. I mean, not literally speaking, but figuratively speaking. So what does that mean for this question? Well, oftentimes in commentary about the current state of our politics, when people are criticizing what's happening, they typically look to the president. And the president is the problem. And I think when you start off with this articulation, what you begin to see is that the president exercising powers that the president has, or maybe doesn't have, but regardless, the president taking action isn't the problem. It's the absence of a check on the president that is the problem. So right off the bat, we begin to shift away from this notion of the president is the sole problem to the notion that maybe the problem is the Congress, for instance. The other thing that it does is it helps to clarify that when the president is using a lot of the powers that some people are concerned about today, these are powers that Congress gave the president. So again, we're now reinforcing this very notion of where our focus ought to lie, which is again in Congress. Right? And so the last thing I would say here, and I'll turn it over to our distinguished panelists, and I've tried to make it a habit of only appearing on panels with people that are much smarter than I am, because it makes me look much, much better. But the fundamental point is the system, the bones. If any of you are in remodeling old houses and stuff, I advise against it, but if you like it, this idea of bones, right? You go, this house has got good bones. Our Constitution has good bones. It's there. The powers are there. That's not the problem so far as I can tell. The problem, it seems to me, is that they're not being used. Right? And that is the one thing that our system can't defend against, the absence of conflict. Right? That's the problem. And so if people don't like a particular policy of a particular president, and the fact that this is playing out across administrations, Republican and Democrat, across different congressional majorities, Republican and Democrat, I think further supports the claim that it's not necessarily a policy outcome, but it's something deeper. But that deeper thing isn't that the Constitution isn't up for the challenge. The deeper thing here is that the people in these institutions, in places like Congress, are not using the power that they have to push back. And that's not to say they're right or wrong. Like, they push back, the president pushes back, and then ultimately the people get to decide. And the American people, the voters, aren't using their power to demand action on behalf of their elected representatives, and then holding them to account when that doesn't happen. I'm not here to tell you why that's the case. I don't know. I defer to you all. You look like you're much more equipped to tackle this question than I am. But I do think that the first step towards identifying a solution to current problems has to be accurately understanding what the problem is in the first place. And when you shift all of the focus to the executive, what happens is that you let the one group of people who actually seem to be the problem off the hook. We just need a better president, and then it'll all be great, right? But that kind of thinking is itself fueling this trend that we have towards ever more executive power.
All right, Barbara, is Congress the problem?
Well, first of all, great to be with everybody. Oh, sorry. Yes. Great to be with this group and with this panel, and great to be with you all. And Congress could be a problem if they were there, but they've, as we've already discussed, they're basically AWOL. And, it's very different from the first Trump term. They were planning on being partners, and they did. In the first Trump term, they were going to do a health care plan that didn't really work out. That failed. When they were going to repeal Obamacare, but then they moved on to the tax bill, which got done the end of the first year. Then remember, Trump was always going to do the infrastructure bill, and that never came. But there at least were plans to do things. There were people actually passed bills. I actually passed a bunch of bills that Donald Trump signed. But now, after just doing the re-upping the one big beautiful bill that they did, which was essentially the Trump tax bill upped with some of the additional things that he said he wanted to have in it. Congress has really decided to do nothing. So they have been, they're afraid of Trump and they're afraid of primaries. So they've really avoided being in session once they were going to do put out the Epstein documents. I mean, that was a big thing last year and they were all excited. Remember day one, Pam Bondi was going to get that out on her desk. She was on Fox every day talking about the Epstein files until she actually looked at the Epstein files and then whoopsie, went and told the president, never mind, we're not going to do that. So since that came up, they have only been in session, I guess in the past 4 months, they've only been in session 22 days. So between July 24th and September 1st, they were off 5.5 weeks. And then they were in for 3 weeks where they just had those short work weeks. And then September 20th until now, they've been out in the House. That's the House. Now the Senate is, and they did pass, the bill, but they can't get the Senate to do anything that they can get 60 votes on. So the House has been out 77 of the last 89 days. And you would think they'd be doing anything at home, but they have instructed their members, for the most part, no town halls. And if you see in a few of the town halls, they've not gone well because that one big, beautiful bill, as they call it, although the president did tell them stop calling it that because it is polling very badly. And it's not popular when they have the few people who have ventured out to do town halls, it's not gone well. So they aren't doing them for the most part. So they aren't doing the town halls. They aren't doing oversight because the Epstein things, that hasn't gone well. And remember DOGE, where they were going to talk about all the things they were going to cut. Well, it turned out Elon Musk didn't want to come up to Congress. So the DOGE guy who is out there with his chainsaw and doing all the DOGE things didn't want to come up. He never came up to the DOGE committee. So you didn't have any oversight. So Congress has basically allowed the White House to do everything because the White House has consolidated all the power. And this is also a very weak cabinet operation. Unfortunately, even though I had personally heard from a number of members that they did, initially everyone sort of hoped you wouldn't have people like Pete Hegseth or Tulsi Gabbard or Kash Patel be confirmed, but then one by one, they were intimidated and attacked, and now some of the members like Tom Tillis and Joni Ernst, who aren't going to run, they were intimidated into not voting against the logical people who you should have voted against. And so, now, you've seen all the problems with Pete Hegseth. Even the White House isn't really happy with him. But this is a very weak, cabinet structure. So basically you have Stephen Miller running the government and then Russ Vought cutting the government. So the bills, when they've passed the budget, passing, whatever funding there is, even things that have been agreed upon, then they go in and cut it. So things that have already been agreed upon, and that's why you have this impasse where, the Democrat, I talked to a Democrat last week, I said, well, how, if you agree to something, how can, what will be the guarantee that they won't just do rescissions anyway? Because when Lisa Murkowski finally came on board and agreed, and they got her vote last round, then they just went in and cut the things that they, she agreed, okay, if you put this in, I'll vote for it. Then they went in and rescinded it anyway. So this is how, you can't trust them. You can't even trust them if you're a Republican. And, this is why they're at this impasse now. So, but Congress still won't do anything. Even the people who are retiring are afraid of these guys. So you really don't have a Congress that's operating. So, which brings me to, yes, what do you do? I think if I think the answer is, I think it's a Bible verse somewhere. I don't have, I'm Catholic, so I won't be quoting you what verse it is. But if the people lead, the leaders will follow. And I do think the reinvigoration of civil society, which is a lot what we're doing here, and I know Norm Eisen is going to be speaking later on today, and I know he's working with the Brookings Institution and even working overseas and working on this, and I really think it's the reinvigoration of civil society, which is a lot of what we need to do now, and it's our philanthropies, and it's our 501c3s, and it's a lot of, all of the groups that we all are working with here, as well as, our Rule of Law Society and a lot of the groups that we're all involved with here, because, the things that held last time, the people in the institution, the people within the institutions in the first Trump administration, the guardrails that were there are no longer there either within the administration or within Congress. So we need to rebuild them throughout civil society. Things, when people are talking about the No Kings rally and people being active. I think that's where civil society needs to be active, because this administration is intimidating the media, they're intimidating corporations, they're intimidating now our philanthropies. They've threatened to, they had an executive order that is asking all of the agencies to go after philanthropies. And that has gotten a coalition of philanthropies from left to right now concerned to say, wait a minute, hey, we know, in the future it might be AOC and Bernie who might want to come after philanthropies. So if you start doing this and setting this precedent and coming after civil society, our 501c3s, our philanthropies who are there to, be the people who come in and help us, whether it's being part of the advocacy community or being part of, when things are falling apart in society, when you have natural disasters, or when you just, food banks need people. Again, I'm Catholic, so, the people who are helping our immigrants, or people who are having, just helping people throughout society in any way. If you start going after those philanthropies and attacking them because a certain administration may not like what they see as their perspectives, what will the next administration do to that? So I think we all need to, as organizations and 501c3s, really be part of this effort of civil society where we reactivate our defense of First Amendment of our Constitution, which is sacred. Lend our voices when the rights of speech and expression and association for any group, not just the groups we're involved in, but anyone else's rights who are being attacked. Remember back when the IRS went after certain groups on the right. If they're going to go after groups on the left, we need to be concerned, whether it's our group or someone else's group. We need to also, while we are condemning political violence wherever it comes from, we just had I guess it was a January 6ther who had been pardoned, has made death threats against Hakeem Jeffries, and obviously, we don't, whether political violence, which has been ratcheted way up. I know Stephen Richer knows about that well as other people in this room. I think many of us have probably been on the receiving end of that. You probably have been too, Amanda. And so the speaker was asked about that yesterday, and his go-to answer is often, I'm not familiar with the details of that. Now, certainly when a member of leadership of Congress they'd already arrested this person, so I assume it was the Trump administration had arrested somebody. When somebody has been arrested for violence against a member of your own body, could somebody in the speaker's office at least maybe show him all the news articles of that? This is not difficult, but this is his go-to answer. Again, this morning when they said, hey, Donald Trump is suing the Justice Department and wants $230 million, he said, I'm not familiar with the details. Let's at least be familiar with details when there's violence against one of the members of the body of Congress or any member. We certainly, after what happened, assassination attempts on any kind of public figure, let's make sure we're all familiar with those details and be against that, but we want to make sure that we, while we condemn that political violence, also condemn any attempts to silence, people's free speech, because that's, while we condemn violence, we also want to make sure we can have that free speech. And while there has been very little oversight that's being done in Congress, while the Republicans who are in leadership don't want to do that oversight because they only do it if the president allows it, that doesn't mean that the Democrats can't do it. So it has been, I would recommend that with all of the whistleblowers that have come forward, you've seen them on 60 Minutes, you've seen them having to quit their jobs because they can't do the illegal actions that they're being asked to in various agencies, that when those people come forward and say, I've had to quit my job, I'm a whistleblower, those people can still be given a voice in Congress by Democrats or whatever body wants to hold a hearing. They can still hold a hearing, even if it's a Democrat-only hearing. You can convene a hearing, the Democrats can do this, and say, hey, we asked our colleagues on the other side to come to this hearing. They chose not to. You can have a hearing and have those whistleblowers come forward with whistleblower protections, and they can tell their stories and how and why they, had to leave their jobs at great expense, often to, their careers and their futures, and get those stories on the record. And I think it's important now, as they're preparing for next year, that they get those, on the record. And again, groups like ours can also, we've had those people also come forward. We've provided venues for that. But Congress is a great convener to do that also. And then I was also talking to someone here too, that state legislatures now can also take a role in that. So I think going forward, our state legislatures can also reach out to those people and say, while Congress may not be doing their job, we in the state legislatures would like to hear from you, because we still can be the laboratories of democracy. And if Congress doesn't want to hear about this, let's hear about what we can do about maintaining the rule of law and the Constitution and these norms by listening to these people in our state legislatures too.
Great. I hate to do this, but it's my understanding that James has to leave at 2, and we are extremely eager to hear your presentation, but I'm hoping I can sneak in a quick question for him before he has to leave in a very few short minutes. And so since this panel is devoted to talking about Trump's emergency power abuse, I am very interested in your perspective. There was a great deal of energy when it came to doing some of these reforms in Congress last year. And now suddenly there seems to be no Republicans talking about this issue. So can you give me your read on why those reform efforts fell apart during the Biden administration?
Sure. I think I apologize for having to leave, and Ilya, I apologize. It's going to be, but I would just point out again, from a policy perspective, the problem isn't lack of an ability to do something. And so if the Republicans want to do something when there's a Democrat who's in the White House, but then don't want to do something when there's a Republican in the White House, the problem isn't the system. The problem isn't the Constitution. It's not the bones. The problem is that the elected officials, if it is a problem, don't want to do something. And the way you solve that is that you have voters, their constituents and stakeholders, demand that they do something. And when they don't do something, then you replace them. This is how we got civil rights. This is how all of the great things that have happened in American history, not in spite of the Constitution and its processes, but because of it, have played out. We don't see that dynamic happening right now. And it can be very frustrating to people who say, well, you wanted it now, but you don't want it now, so it must be partisan. It's irrelevant why they're doing it. But the fact is that they have the power to do it, and if people want them to do it, they need to demand that they do it. I agree. It does create certain challenges, especially for members of the House, but also the Senate these days, when a very popular president with your own base doesn't want you to do something you don't want to do, or you want to do. That creates problems. But that is a different problem than Is the system out of whack? Or does the Constitution somehow not work? Right? And so I think the answer to that problem is the same one that Dr. King gave us. It's the same one that leaders of the suffrage movement gave us for 79 years. It's the same answer that we've seen time and time again, which is there is no substitute for getting up in the morning, putting your feet on the ground, looking yourself in the mirror and saying, I'm going to go out and change the world. And probably not, but you got to say it. And then you go out and you try, and it's really hard. And then guess what? You probably go to bed that night not having done it. And then maybe in 80 years, you might prevail. I think today we often look for very quick solutions to problems that we then say are very deep problems. And instead of looking ourselves in the mirror and saying, is the person I'm voting for, is the person who's in office right now, are they the problem or are they a victim? Because right now we're all kind of conditioned to think of ourselves as victims. And it seems to me that these problems, I don't want to minimize people's concerns about the policy problems that we confront today. That's not the point. The problem is we have all the solutions we need right there in front of us, right there. And the fact that they're not even trying, and this is the last thing I'll say, like, it's not just Republicans. It's like, no members of Congress, even when, like, you would expect the minority to try to force votes in the Senate, they're not doing that. You would expect members of the minority in the House to hold hearings. We used to do that all the time. They don't do that anymore. No one's trying. Why? Because it's not their problem. It's like, you walk around, it's like there's some ghost, like from Scooby-Doo. And he's like, well, who's this? Oh, I don't know. They talk about themselves in the third person. It's like the bill was passed. I'm like, what do you mean it was passed? You passed the bill. Or you voted against the bill and your colleagues passed the bill. The accountability lies in Congress. It always has, and it always will. The president is using powers now that Congress gave the president. The president may be abusing them in some people's views, but the fact that he's doing so is because Congress is letting him do it. If you don't like what Russ Vote's doing, then don't fund Russ Vote. Just cut it off. Get rid of the OMB. You don't need to do that. If you like what Russ Vote's doing, then you stand up and stop that and say, this is why we need to fund Russ Vote. And you know what happens? A debate. And then out of that debate, a bunch of different ideas come together. People then transcend their own kind of little limited perspectives. And then you get a better understanding of reality in the round. And that is why our system works. It's through conflict, not the absence of conflict, not the silencing of people. The First Amendment rights are so important because they're associational rights. They're the things you have to be able to participate in politics. And that's what we need to see. And it's not that the system doesn't work. The system's there. We just need to use it. But with that, I apologize for going on so long. Ilya, I would just thank you all. I've got to run. I'm so sorry.
All right, you're doing your best to constrain the president's imperial powers, so take the mic.
Yeah, it's all my fault. So I assume the mic is working well enough that you can hear me. And the focus of this panel is presidential emergency powers, how they're being abused, and what can be done to constrain them. I'm going to go over three major areas where they are being abused to a great degree. And I'm going to talk about how, in principle, Congress could put an end to all of this tomorrow if they wanted to, but there are significant structural and political constraints, not all of them rooted in Congress itself, which prevent them from doing so. Some of the problems we have with emergency powers is that Congress has over the years passed various emergency power statutes, which are broadly worded and vague and seem to delegate a lot of power to the president. And therefore, to some degree, we have normalized the use of emergency powers even during times and for issues which are not meaningfully emergencies. And that's a bad thing. But to some extent, what has happened under the Trump administration is that they're taking emergency powers and using them in situations where it goes well beyond what even the broadly worded statutes actually allow. And that is what we are confronting in the three major areas of tariffs, immigration, and domestic use of the military. So there is some blame here for Congress in that they passed broadly worded statutes, which have allowed various abuses under previous administrations as well. But to some extent, we have an administration that is simply going beyond even what these statutes allow. For example, in the area of tariffs, as many of you probably know, the president has used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 to start what is essentially the biggest trade war since the Great Depression, imposing 10% or more tariffs on virtually every country in the world. This is all being done under a law which does not even mention the word tariffs or a synonym like impost or taxes or duties. Relevant to our discussion here, this law can only be used in the event of an unusual and extraordinary threat to American security or the economy or the like, and the ostensible rationale for most of these tariffs is trade deficits. There's nothing unusual or extraordinary about them. Most economists would say they're not actually a threat at all, but in any case, something that has been going on for decades is by definition not unusual and extraordinary. And as you likely know, there are a number of cases in the courts challenging these tariffs, including one in which I am co-counsel, VOS Selections versus Trump. We won in the Court of International Trade, the trial court, also in the Federal Circuit. The appellate court, now our case along with two others, is before the Supreme Court. We'll see what they decide. But there's a number of issues in the case. I won't bore you with all the details, but the one that's relevant to this panel is the idea that the unusual and extraordinary threat language is meaningful language that really is supposed to constrain presidential discretion versus the president's claim that he can just decide for himself whether something is an unusual and extraordinary threat or an emergency. It also requires an emergency declaration as well. So we'll see what the Supreme Court says about that. But this is, the notion of unusual and extraordinary threat, it's somewhat vague. But what's going on now is pushing the tariffs, assuming even that this law allows tariffs at all, it is pushing the notion of unusual and extraordinary way beyond, I think, any plausible limit, unless you want to assume that it just means whatever the president at any given time says that it means. We have a similar story in the area of immigration, where the president has declared that there is an invasion across the southern border, and therefore issued an executive order relying on a clause of the Constitution which gives the federal government the power to defend the states against invasion. He has used that executive order to shut down nearly all legal migration pathways across the southern border. He has also invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which allows detention and deportation of non-citizens, including legal immigrants, so long as there is a declared war, an invasion, or a predatory incursion going on. In the past, this act has only been invoked in the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II, all very obvious, massive declared wars. But the claim now is that illegal migration and drug smuggling qualify as invasion. That's the rationale for the invasion executive order I mentioned earlier. It's also the rationale for using the Alien Enemies Act for purposes of detaining and deporting supposed members of the Venezuelan drug gang Tren de Aragua. This issue is also now before the courts. Most courts have ruled that there is not an invasion or a predatory incursion because, as James Madison said, addressing this very issue, an invasion is an operation of war. Illegal migration, drug smuggling, and so forth do not qualify. Even a predatory incursion, the most likely definition of that is that it's a smaller scale military attack, one not as big as an invasion, not merely any illegal activity across the border, drug smuggling, migration, and the like. So most courts who have heard the question have ruled against the administration, but one district court did rule there's a predatory incursion, even if there isn't an invasion, and another one has ruled the whole thing is a political question so that the president can just decide whether there's an invasion or not. We'll see this issue is likely to return to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has already said in the JGG case that the provisions of the Alien Enemies Act are subject to judicial review. review. Courts can construe what an invasion is, a predatory incursion is, and so on, but there's still an issue of to what extent they can review the president's factual claims. If he says there's an invasion, does he actually have to prove it, or do courts just have to take his word for it? I think the answer is that he does have to prove it, and that judicial review of such matters should not be deferential. If there is an actual invasion going on, it should be pretty darned obvious that it's happening, like Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine is very obviously an invasion. You don't need an expert on the invasion clauses like me. I'm writing articles about this to know that an invasion happened there, or to know that Al-Qaeda's attack on the U.S. 9/11 was an invasion, or at least a predatory incursion, and so on. Whereas with illegal migration and drug smuggling, they're way in a different category than that. And finally, you have a similar story with the domestic use of the military, now in Chicago, in Portland, in LA, and perhaps soon elsewhere, where they have been relying on a statute, 10 U.S.C. section 10246, which says that the president can federalize the National Guard and use them for at least some law enforcement purposes when there's an invasion, a rebellion, or an inability to enforce the law with regular forces. They've been claiming that various protests against IC and the like qualify as a rebellion, and an inability to enforce the law with regular forces. Courts have sort of divided on this. 3 district courts have ruled against the administration on it. The 7th Circuit in the Illinois case has upheld the district court ruling. The 9th Circuit in the Oregon and LA cases has so far ruled against it. There's talk maybe it will go to the en banc 9th Circuit, where you have like 15 or 20 judges hearing the case rather than a panel of 3. We'll see what happens. And here too, as in the other cases, a big issue is if the president claims that an emergency situation exists, a rebellion, an invasion, an extraordinary unusual threat, and so forth, do courts have to defer to him? Do they have to take his word for it? Or does he actually have to prove that this kind of condition exists? In my view, if a statute or power can only be used when there is some kind of extraordinary emergency circumstance, the burden of proof is on the side asserting that that power or the prerequisites to using that power actually exist. And when they do exist, it should not be hard to prove it. A real rebellion, invasion, and so forth is not hard to detect. Like, it's very clear when you look at the Civil War era cases, the Civil War was in fact a rebellion. You don't really need me to tell you that. And I think it should also be clear that a small number of anti-IC protesters, even if some of them turn violent or are doing illegal things, that's just nowhere near the same category as the Civil War, an actual invasion, a rebellion, and so on. And even the an ability to enforce the law with regular forces, that's a more arguable issue. But unless you want to say this applies any time when federal law isn't fully enforced, or when some people are getting away with violating it, then I think what you need to conclude, and as the district courts generally have concluded, that what this means is a general breakdown of civil order, like the LA riots of 1992, when similar laws were invoked, as opposed to merely we can't 100% fully enforce the laws, because that's not possible at any time. I don't want to shock this young and impressionable audience, but right here in Washington, D.C., and where I live in Virginia, there's huge numbers of people that get away with violating federal law on a regular basis. More than half of all adult Americans have used marijuana at some point in their lives or admit they did so in surveys. The true number is probably higher. That's a federal crime, and we're nowhere near fully enforcing that particular federal law, but that doesn't mean the president can use military forces anytime he finds a community where there's a large number of people who get away with violating the federal law against marijuana, or who don't fully pay their taxes, or violate any number of other federal laws that we can't even come close to fully enforcing. So all of this, I think, is a threat to the rule of law, not just a problem with the particular statutes and constitutional provisions, because if you put it together, if the president can in effect impose any tariffs he wants on any nation and any products for any reason, if he can use military forces virtually any time that he wants for domestic law enforcement, if he can declare that virtually any group of immigrants are actually enemy aliens and therefore subject to the Alien Enemies Act, as which he can if illegal migration and drug smuggling qualify as invasion, because those things happen virtually any time time since we've had drug prohibition and immigration restrictions. I would actually, if it were up to me, I would get rid of most of both. But so long as we do have those things, we're going to have an invasion under this definition going on pretty much all the time. So if you have one man getting to decide when to use these extraordinary powers whenever he wants, that's an obvious threat to the rule of law. Now, as a matter of pure legality or constitutional structure, Congress can put an end to this at virtually any time. They can repeal this legislation. They can clarify it to close loopholes, like they can say an invasion means a military attack, or that an inability to enforce the law with regular forces only exists when there's a total breakdown of civil order, or there's other ways they can modify this. There are also a number of other good reform proposals for modifying emergency powers more generally, such as, for instance, Senator Mike Lee's proposal made during the first Trump administration to limit national emergencies to a duration of 30 days, after which they can only be continued if Congress affirmatively votes to put them through. But there is little willingness in Congress to do anything. Some of it is the partisan dynamics you've already described. Republican members of Congress don't want to limit a president or own party. They're afraid of being primaried and so forth. But some of it is a deeper dynamic that when the president abuses powers and goes beyond what's even allowed on the books, the only way Congress could stop it is with a veto-proof majority, which is almost impossible to achieve on anything significant that the president doesn't want. And if you have to have a veto-proof majority, that deters even trying to do it in many cases. Finally, it's true, as was said earlier, that if the voters were all up in arms about this and made this their highest priority in election, they could achieve the election of people to Congress who would even get a veto-proof majority, perhaps, but most voters don't know much about these issues. They're what scholars call rationally ignorant. I have a whole book about this called Democracy and Political Ignorance, where I talk about this. There's a large literature by others as well. Most voters don't know much about these emergency powers. They don't know how they work. They don't prioritize this in election, and politicians respond to those sorts of incentives. You see that now, not just with the Republicans, with the Democrats. Did the Democrats go for a government shutdown because of these emergency powers abuses? No, they didn't say we'll only fund the government if you end all these abuses. The issue they've decided to focus on is Obamacare subsidies, and I don't like that decision, but I understand the political incentives for it. The Obamacare subsidies are popular. Healthcare costs are upper mind in the minds of voters who don't know much about most other issues. So Democratic strategists clearly decided that this issue is more of a winner than protecting the Constitution and curbing emergency powers. And you can blame the politicians and strategists for this, but there's clearly a deeper structural problem here. There's not an easy way to overcome it, but in an article I published a couple months ago in The Unpopulist, I described, based on historical experience, as the editor, Shika Dalmi, is here. Welcome, Shika. She had to go through the pain of editing this article. And the idea is that what we want is a combined strategy of litigation and political action of a kind that has been successful in past history with the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the gun rights movements, and property rights movements, and others, where you use litigation because it can be helpful, as it has been, I think, to some degree already this year. But it also, litigation can help stimulate political action if you bring cases which attract attention with sympathetic facts. And the reverse can also be true. Political action can help out litigation. The courts are more likely to act strongly if they feel that they will have public and elite support for what they're doing. But I admit this is a difficult challenge because there is a deeper structural problem. It's not just a matter of some bad politicians, though I do blame the politicians with due respect to Representative Comstock. And it's not just a matter of one party or even one man, Donald Trump. It's a deeper dynamic of most voters not knowing or understanding much about these issues, which is rooted in structural incentives. More can be said, but for now I'll stop because I know I'm sure we have a lot of questions and discussion.
Let's talk more about what the definition of an emergency is. As you pointed out, Congress did give the president these emergency powers, believing he would invoke them in good faith in the event of an actual emergency. Given the fact that we are not privileged to live in that reality, what do you think members of Congress, particularly thinking about Republican members, how could we get some oversight on these just definitional terms? And given that we have so many emergencies to choose from, potentially Which one do you think would be the most persuasive? Would it be tariffs, because traditionally Republicans have cared about deficits and spending?
Well, I do think, I mean, everyone, as was in an earlier panel when they clearly defined, we should not call them tariffs, it's taxes. And that has been, I mean, I know George Allen has been very good, former governor of Virginia, as pointing out that these are taxes, and Republicans usually have wanted to place these taxes on people. So these are taxes, and they've been put on, just extensively everywhere. And Republicans usually haven't been running around imposing new taxes on everyone, and they're regressive. And if there were hearings, whether they're on, again, if Congress won't hold them, state legislatures that have, I mean, a lot of states have really been impacted by these tariffs. A lot of Midwest states, a lot of swing states have been impacted on them. So maybe some of these states, maybe Pennsylvania could do this. Virginia will be able to do some of this. So if you start talking about how these are impacting your states, even if Congress won't do it, then you can point out some of these emergency powers that have been used to raise your taxes, why they're a problem. Then you can start asking Congress why they aren't using their power because they could do this. So I think the terms need to be changed and stop calling them tariffs, because nobody understands, what tariffs are. But why does everything cost more? Because everyone's understanding that they haven't, prices haven't gone down, and the reason prices haven't gone down is because these unilateral tariffs are being, exerted on everything, and Trump is amassing all this money that he's talking about being on the shelf, that he keeps going out and getting things. But this vision of, he's destroying the White House, he's spending all this money, and he's going around doing everything. This is politically, this is, horrific for Republicans, that he is raising the costs of all of these everyday items that he said he was going to reduce, while he's on a spending binge, and nobody's doing anything, and Congress isn't having hearings, and they're not explaining why your costs of cars and groceries, remember that word groceries that Donald Trump discovered? Well, they're still expensive, and now he's going to import Argentinian beef, which apparently they've got problems with their beef. What is it, foot and mouth disease they have?
He's not going to make us vegetarians, is he?
Yeah, so so I think, yes, there needs to be, that's an area where I don't think the Republicans aren't going to, I do support that. I think in a new Congress where there'll be people who actually want to legislate, I agree that we should have those 30-day limits and go back to, I don't think Mike Lee probably supports his own bill now, but
I'm not saying he does.
Yeah, but I do think that would be a wise way to, when there's sort of some neutrality and people can look at this with some fresh eyes, that would be a good way to deal with it and say, listen, there's been faults on both sides. Let's look at this again and do that. But right now, I think it's going to have to come from outside of Congress in a way, and it'll have to come with political consequences.
I wonder if I could say a brief word about tariffs in Congress, in that, in general, I try to avoid the pundit's fallacy, which is the idea of saying whatever you believe is right to do politically, is right to do as a matter of policy, is also politically advantageous. I know I have many unpopular views, and indeed, I'm the guy who wrote a book about why voters are often ignorant and wrong about a whole range of issues. Tariffs is to some degree an exception to that. If you look at the survey data on these tariffs, they're extremely unpopular. Moreover, if you look at the history of tariff issues, both in this country and elsewhere, you see that you can successfully mobilize public opposition against tariffs on the very ground that Representative Comstock just mentioned, that they raise people's prices, and particularly the prices for lower income, working class, lower middle class people. Go to the grocery store, the prices are higher, cars are more expensive, and so on. Richard Cobden in the Anti-Corn League figured this out in Britain in the 1840s, when the average voter was much more ignorant even, or less educated than the average voter today. Many were illiterate and the like, but he got that message across, and he managed to get Parliament to repeal the corn laws. If you look at the polls today, tariffs are maybe possibly Trump's most unpopular policy, with like 2-to-1 public opposition to it. And a lot of people do understand that they're raising prices and are mad about it. And I think, again, rarely do I question the judgment of professional political strategists on issues within their expertise, but I think Democratic Party strategists are not making nearly enough of this issue. I'm not the only one who says this. Nate Silver, who is a professional political strategy consultant, wrote a piece about how the Democrats should make ending the tariffs their shutdown demand more so than the Obamacare subsidies, because although that demand is popular, ending the tariffs would be even more so and would attract a broader constituency. So a movement for free trade, for repealing various statutes that do gives the president some tariff delegations and the like, as well as perhaps for reforming IEPA, though of course our view is that IEPA already doesn't authorize any tariffs, much less tariffs on this scale, but Congress could clarify and make that clear that, IEPA doesn't do that, and it would be popular because people hate high prices, and enough people do understand, or can be easily made to understand, that when you impose a massive tax, thank you for that word, a massive tax on the goods that you buy, that makes them more expensive. That's easier to understand than something like, well, the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which can be done during an invasion, that's a serious threat, although it is actually a serious threat to people's civil liberties. But the tariff issue is more easily understandable, and that is one where both members of Congress and other political leaders, I think, are to some degree missing an opportunity. Democrats and some Republicans have spoken out against this, but they haven't made it as much of an issue as survey data suggests they would benefit from doing.
Well, I think part of that is because the way they're now redistricting and doing all these the gerrymandered districts in a lot of the states, they're trying to protect themselves in a way where they think they really don't have to answer to the voters. But I think they may be in for a surprise. I mean, a lot of the Republicans who are in these safe districts, they're going to be in new districts, and they may not realize that people still care about the price of things, even if, look at Marjorie Taylor Greene, of all people, is the person who's telling everybody, hey, the prices are really bad, and you should be doing something about this. And she's in a very red district, but it does baffle me that Republicans, and I think it's because they're not having these town halls and they're just ignoring their constituents because they're more fearful of Trump than they are of their own constituents.
I want to talk more about the tariffs case because it is being heard next week, as I understand it, and Donald Trump has suggested he may attend the hearing, which suggests he has a high...
Intimidate the
Supreme understands
Court
the stakes of that. So I'd like your reaction on that. But then can you also delve into a little bit more about what you believe the Supreme Court would be green lighting if they allow these tariffs to stand? But also, what would a strong decision look like in terms of possibly sending a broader message, maybe to Congress, about this definition of what an emergency is?
Sure. So on the first one, all I can say is, hopefully his presence or lack thereof at the hearing will not impact the outcome. On the second, I think we have like 5 or 6 different arguments in the case as to why these tariffs are illegal, and depending on if we were to win, depending on which one of them the court accepted, the implications might be different. So the court could decide this based on an issue like the definition of emergency, which is a word obviously that occurs in the National Emergencies Act and other statutes. They could also decide it on the definition of an unusual and extraordinary threat, which I just mentioned in my presentation. That's a phrase that doesn't really occur in very many laws other than IEPA, so it wouldn't have as much of a presidential effect. But they could also decide this based on non-delegation principles under the Constitution, which say there are limits to how much legislative power Congress can delegate to the executive, or under the major questions doctrine, which says that when the executive claims that it has been delegated the power to decide some major social or economic issue, it has to be clearly stated. That's how Biden's massive loan forgiveness program was struck down, a number of other initiatives as well. Biden's loan forgiveness program involved $400 billion, which is a lot of money. These IEPA tariffs, they involve something like 3 or 4 times that much in new taxes that would be imposed, plus other effects. So obviously a major questions doctrine decision would be a precedent that would have impacts elsewhere, at least in terms of legal doctrine, what lower courts would see themselves as having to do in future cases. Whether it would have an impact on Congress, I think that's difficult for me to say. I think it's to some extent a matter of not just how Congress reacted, but how broader society reacted to that and the like. But in principle, as I've tried to emphasize in my writings over the years, there is an interactive dynamic sometimes between litigation and political action, and that the two could be mutually reinforcing, and perhaps the same thing could occur here. Maybe, I say maybe because obviously can't know for sure, but maybe a win in court for us could also help stimulate more of a free trade political movement in the United States, which I think we badly need, and also could help stimulate Congress, if not this Congress and a future Congress, to limit the sort of delegated presidential powers in this area and possibly even in some other areas as well. We'll have to see.
I was struck in an earlier panel by someone who suggested that the coalition has done a poor job anticipating Trump's next executive power abuses. And I'm just wondering, as a question to both of you, do you see anyone that anticipated Trump would use IEPA to enact tariffs in this sweeping way? Because that seemed to come out of left field. Yes or no?
So I think there are some trade policy experts who wrote about IEPA as a possible tool, and it was even considered in the first Trump administration. But yes, the scale of it has been bigger certainly than I expected, though I did predict before the election, that Trump would engage in large-scale tariffs. He has done it even more, than I thought that he would, and I didn't have at that time a strong view of whether it would be IEPA or Section 232 or something else. It seems like they've been attracted to IEPA precisely because, since it doesn't even mention tariffs, there are no structural or procedural constraints intended to constrain tariffs, for the reason that the statute probably wasn't supposed to be used for tariffs to begin with. And so they're attracted to this with the idea that if they can use it, they can use it virtually without limit, whereas the other statutes do have at least some constraints.
Well, and I think you always have to beware, as I referenced sort of in that rebuilding of civil society and protecting civil society, that if they lose, or if they lose in part in this, that they will go after the organizations, the foundations, the people who are contradicting them, who are disagreeing with them, because that's been their MO, and they've been so aggressive, whether it's going after the media, going after anybody who is not with them. I mean, in the press, they are basically telling everybody, he keeps a list of who's naughty and nice there. So I think that's why I think, since Congress isn't doing any of the oversight, why it's so important that we have this reinvigoration and this protection in civil society of all of our the 501c3 status, the civil society, and that we make sure that that is maintained. And that's very much unique to the United States, but also that when we look out, across our partners in democracy throughout the world, that we have that. Because, when we look at what's going on with Ukraine, and, that Trump isn't, there for them and goes hot and cold there, that, we're helping those groups and democracy groups abroad, because, they need that same type of help, because they aren't when they aren't going to get it from us here, that they have that same type of support in their civil society organizations.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We are at time. I want to thank you for the thoughtful conversation. It's a bright spot ahead. I hope you will all wish luck in his case next month.